In 1847, federal reports recorded the strange disappearance of Inspector William Hartwell, who had been investigating unusually high death rates along the Natchez Trace in Mississippi. His last telegram, sent on October 15th from Natchez, claimed he had uncovered horrors beyond record-keeping at 7 plantations belonging to the richest families in the district. 3 weeks later, authorities found his abandoned carriage near the Orban mansion, and what they discovered would unravel one of the darkest conspiracies in the antebellum South. For more than 8 years, a secret society of plantation mistresses had run what they called correctional exchanges, a network that traded enslaved men between estates for increasingly brutal punishments. The details were so shocking that Governor Albert Gallatin Brown ordered all files sealed, and for more than 150 years, the truth lay hidden in government archives. More than 200 men lost their lives, their bodies uncovered in unmarked graves across 7 plantations, each showing signs of systematic torture that pushed human cruelty to unimaginable levels. The autumn of 1847 became a turning point that exposed the extreme violence concealed within America's wealthiest region. Natchez at that time stood as the very symbol of Southern power, a 30-mile stretch along the Mississippi River, where cotton profits created more millionaires per capita than anywhere else in the nation. Enormous mansions like Auburn Melrose and Stanton Hall rose above endless fields of cotton, their polished Greek Revival columns hiding the suffering that funded such extravagance. The climate itself worsened misery with summers so deadly that a man could collapse within hours, and winters that froze through flimsy slave cabins. The moss-draped oaks gave the land a ghostly air, while the river carried away evidence of countless crimes. At the center of this world stood 7 dynasties: the Vandenbergs of Elmwood, the Dabneys of Riverside, the Pembrokes of Magnolia Grove, the Vanderhorsts of Cedar Hill, the Fairfaxes of Willowmere, the Hawthorns of Oakwood, and the Belmontes of Roseland. These families had intermarried for generations, creating an insulated aristocracy that considered itself untouchable. Their wealth extended beyond cotton into steamboats, banks, and textile mills. The women of these clans, Charlotte Vandenberg, Elela Nena, Dabney, Victoria Pembroke, Constance Vanderhorst, Isabella Fairfax, Henrietta Hawthorne, and Lucinda Belmont, had grown up together in privilege, attending elite finishing schools in Charleston and Savannah, and absorbing the same European philosophies that reinforced their sense of superiority. By 1847, they were women of influence, ranging from their late 20s to mid-40s, married to men often absent on business in major southern and northern cities, leaving them in command of estates that hid some of the most disturbing cruelties in American history. Charlotte Vandenberg, the eldest at 45, was known as the sharpest mind in the district. Fluent in French and German, she corresponded with European thinkers and kept a personal library of more than 3,000 volumes. With her husband Willem spending months away in New Orleans, managing shipping interests, Charlotte held near total control over Elmwood's 15,000 acres and its 800 enslaved people. Eleanor Dabney, at 38, was celebrated for her so-called scientific curiosity. She had studied anatomy and physiology through correspondence with physicians at Charleston Medical College and kept exhaustive records on weather crops and what she described as human behavior. With her husband often traveling north to deal with textile mills, Eleanor enjoyed wide freedom to pursue her increasingly unsettling interests. The younger women each added their own peculiar passions to the circle. Victoria Pembroke, 32, leaned on European anthropological texts to promote theories of racial hierarchy. Constance Vanderhorst, 29, became absorbed in what she termed social engineering, the belief that people could be molded through carefully applied pressure and reward. Isabella Fairfax, Henrietta Hawthorne, and Lucinda Belmont, ranging from 28 to 35, contributed their own obsessions with psychology and control. What united these women was not simply wealth or education, but the conviction that their breeding and intellect gave them the right to treat human beings as material for experiments. They convinced themselves their cruelty had a higher purpose, advancing knowledge about race and social discipline. The enslaved population of the district numbered over 3,000, with adult men making up nearly 40%. These men endured back-breaking work in cotton fields, dangerous tasks in mills and gins where machinery tore off limbs, and swampland labor where disease spread easily. They struggled to care for families in flimsy quarters that offered no shield against the increasingly creative torments devised by their owners. The mistresses learned that targeting loved ones often broke men faster than direct violence, so they began charting family ties across plantations to identify which connections could be turned into weapons. Inspector William Hartwell arrived in Natchez on September 20th, 1847, carrying Treasury Department credentials and orders to investigate suspiciously high death rates among the enslaved. At 34, Hartwell had built a reputation as a relentless investigator in Maine, exposing corruption in textile mills and fraud in land offices. He was chosen precisely because he had no ties to the South and no financial stake in its cotton empire. Washington cared little for humanitarian reasons. Enslaved deaths represented wasted labor that threatened cotton output and tax revenues. Hartwell began at Elmwood Plantation, where Charlotte Vandenberg welcomed him with the polished charm that made her a fixture of Mississippi society. Her parlor was a theater of wealth French wallpaper, worth more than most families earned in 10 years, Venetian chandeliers, Persian carpets, and oil paintings from European masters. But as Hartwell spread out the mortality records across her polished dining table, a troubling pattern became clear. In the last year and a half, 15 enslaved men between 20 and 35 had died from causes listed as sudden illness, accident, heart failure, or attempted escape. This rate was nearly triple the district average and worse than the infamous Caribbean sugar plantations. The deaths came in clusters, several in quick succession, followed by long quiet periods. When Hartwell compared the dates with shipping logs, he saw they aligned with the comings and goings of steamboats connecting the 7 plantations, pointing to deliberate coordination. When he asked to examine bodies or speak with witnesses, Charlotte's gracious mask hardened. Her smile remained fixed, but her tone turned sharp as she adjusted her silk gloves. "Inspector," she said evenly, "surely a gentleman of your refinement understands that matters of plantation discipline demand discretion. These poor souls died because they could not adapt to the civilized order we provide here." Charlotte dismissed the deaths with chilling detachment, insisting that their primitive natures simply could not withstand the rigors of labor, and suggesting that Hartwell would be better served admiring cotton yields and tax revenues. But Hartwell's persistence was ironclad, and her evasions only deepened his resolve. When he demanded to inspect the slave quarters, her resistance turned sharper. She claimed storms had damaged some cabins, others housed contagious workers, and the rest would provide no useful insight into the dead men. Only when Hartwell threatened a federal subpoena did Charlotte relent, agreeing to escort him on a tightly controlled tour. What he found left him shaken. Several quarters bore signs of recent renovation, their doors reinforced with heavy locks, their windows barred with iron, and their walls padded with layers of moss clay and timber that muffled sound. Charlotte insisted these were merely punishment cells for violent workers, but the sophistication and expense of the modifications told another story. The enslaved men Hartwell encountered unsettled him even more. Young and strong in body, they moved as if in constant pain, their eyes darting nervously and avoiding contact. Scars crisscrossed their flesh in patterns too deliberate to be accidents. What disturbed Hartwell most was their demeanor, men who should have carried the stubborn pride common among the enslaved. Instead appeared hollowed out, broken, stripped of something essential. They shuffled like shadows, their voices whispers barely audible, their humanity dimmed as if crushed under invisible weight. An elderly woman named Celia risked everything to warn him when Charlotte's back was turned. With trembling urgency, she whispered, "They take the young strong ones to the other houses. They go upright like men, but they come back different. Like something inside them's been broke and can't never be fixed." Before Hartwell could press for more, Charlotte appeared with the quiet menace of a predator. Her syrupy voice cut like a blade as she dismissed Celia's words as the confused ramblings of an old woman sending her scurrying off in terror. The moment cemented Hartwell's conviction that he had stumbled onto something monstrous. That night, reviewing his notes at the Natchez Inn, Hartwell was approached by a man who would change the course of his investigation. Samuel Fletcher, a free black carpenter of 42, carried himself with the composure of someone who had survived by walking a razor's edge in a hostile world. Renowned for his craftsmanship and discretion, he had worked in some of the finest homes across Mississippi and beyond, earning access to places few men of his color could enter. With his eyes sweeping the room for eavesdroppers, Fletcher spoke in a low voice. "Inspector, there are things you need to know. Things that happen when honest folks are asleep and the devil walks free." Over the next hour, Fletcher unburdened secrets that reframed everything. He revealed he had been hired to construct rooms and furniture in several of the plantations over the last 3 years. Projects so disturbing they weighed on his conscience. "They wanted chambers that no sound could escape," he whispered. "Stone floors with drains like butcher shops. Places not meant for living, but for something else entirely." Would you like me to expand Fletcher's revelations into a full scene of horror detailing exactly what he built? What he suspected was happening inside those chambers, and how it set Hartwell on the path to uncovering the correctional exchanges. The walls Fletcher had built were lined with thick leather padding that swallowed every sound. The furniture he constructed made no sense for daily life, tables fitted with restraints chairs designed to immobilize a man. Devices that looked like relics from medieval torture chambers. While working on these projects, he heard whispers from overseers and house slaves. Fragments of forbidden conversations that, when pieced together, revealed something far darker than punishment. The mistresses were not simply disciplining disobedient men. They were carrying out calculated experiments in human degradation. When Fletcher asked about the purpose of these strange rooms, he was told they were for medical treatments of difficult slaves, supposedly developed with the help of New Orleans physicians studying mental illness. But Fletcher knew the difference between healing and deliberate cruelty. He had seen men moved between plantations under the cover of darkness, always the strongest, youngest ones, men with families and fire in their hearts. They left with shoulders squared and eyes alive with defiance. But when they returned, they were hollow shells. Their bodies intact, but their spirits shattered. They walked like ghosts, avoided every gaze, and carried a fear so deep it seemed to bleed from their very skin. Fletcher's voice faltered when he described the gatherings he called the monthly meetings. Each month, the 7 mistresses rotated, hosting elaborate social events. But what happened behind the gilded walls was not ordinary hospitality. While working late one night at Riverside Estate, he saw them dressed in jewels and silks. But outside in the yard, torches burned in strange patterns. Enslaved men were shifted from place to place, and there were noises, sounds that were not quite screams, yet not human either. He admitted he could not describe them without his stomach twisting. Before leaving, Fletcher pressed a small leather-bound journal into Hartwell's hands. It had belonged to Marcus Washington, an enslaved man at Riverside Estate, who had died only weeks earlier. Marcus had secretly learned to read and write, taught by a house slave, educated alongside her mistress's children. He had hidden the journal in his cabin until his wife Sarah, desperate to preserve his words, passed it to Fletcher before she was sold away. That night, by the flickering light of a candle, Hartwell read Marcus's entries. Written in a careful, steady hand, they chronicled horrors that defied belief. Marcus described being borrowed by the different mistresses, each with her own methods of cruelty, masked as discipline. He wrote of being forced to watch other men suffer, of enduring medical experiments that had no purpose but to measure agony, of deliberate attempts to dismantle the human soul by weaponizing pain, fear, and despair. One entry, dated just 2 weeks before his death, froze Hartwell's blood. Marcus described Elena Dabney's loyalty experiment on Samuel Robinson. She had Samuel chained to a specially built table while his wife Mary and their young son Thomas were tied in his view. Elena asked Samuel whether he loved his family more than he feared her. Every time he professed love for them, she inflicted pain on Mary. Every time he admitted fear of his mistress, she turned her cruelty on the boy. For 3 hours, Samuel endured the impossible choice until his mind fractured. At last, he begged for the torment to stop renouncing both love and family. Elena Marcus timed everything with her pocket watch, recording her observations like a scientist conducting an experiment. The journal contained dozens of such accounts, each more grotesque than the last. They revealed a systematic effort not only to control, but to annihilate the human spirit, reducing men to hollow shells by exploiting their deepest bonds of love, loyalty, and hope. Hartwell's investigation soon uncovered that what he was dealing with was no spontaneous cruelty, but an organized system that had been growing quietly for nearly a decade, refined with the precision of a scientific study. Through seized correspondence, financial records, shipping manifests, and whispered testimony from men like Samuel Fletcher, he began reconstructing the birth of what the women themselves chillingly referred to as the correctional circle. It had begun in 1839, almost innocently, when Charlotte Vandenberg and Eleanor Dabney, both graduates of Madame Talvandi's School for Young Ladies in Charleston, recognized in one another a shared dissatisfaction with the limits of conventional discipline. Their early letters sounded like the chatter of any plantation mistress, filled with complaints about disobedience and the burdens of maintaining order. They wrote about reduced rations, extra labor, solitary confinement, and the public lash. But by 1841, the tone had shifted. Charlotte, frustrated by what she called the disturbing resilience of enslaved men, argued that the true key was not in punishing the body, but in reshaping the mind itself. Eleanor responded with agreement, citing European writings on psychology and social engineering. She suggested temporary transfers of enslaved men between plantations, allowing each mistress to apply her own methods. A failure under one regime could become a success under another. This simple idea of experimental exchanges became the foundation of their conspiracy. Victoria Pembroke was the first to join them, drawn in by her insecurity over her absent husband and her hunger to prove herself as an intellectual equal to men. Her letters revealed a fierce determination to demonstrate mastery over what she called the ultimate human challenge, breaking the will of the Negro male. Constance Vanderhorst followed soon after, lured by her friendship with Victoria and her obsession with European medical texts on madness and the treatment of mental disorders. She wrote of applying similar principles to what she believed was the innate rebelliousness of enslaved men. By 1843, Isabella Fairfax, Henrietta Hawthorne, and Lucinda Belmonte had completed the circle. Each brought a distinct obsession. Isabella pursued what she chillingly termed loyalty engineering, erasing family bonds and reorienting devotion entirely toward a mistress. Henrietta fixated on identity reconstruction, convinced she could dissolve a man's very self and rebuild him like clay in her own design. Lucinda contributed the most openly sadistic element, focusing on pain and torture, but with clinical precision rather than uncontrolled violence, noting the method's timing and effects like a scientist charting data. By 1844, their letters no longer read like scattered thoughts, but like policy documents complete with protocols and procedures. The correctional circle had rules. Men would be transferred between plantations for set periods ranging from a week to half a year. Each mistress had absolute authority during a subject's stay, including over his body, mind, and family ties. And each case was meticulously documented. The records cataloged psychological traits, physical strength, family relationships, religious beliefs, even favorite hymns and secret fears. From the first lash to the last whispered confession, nothing was left unrecorded. Hartwell realized he was looking at something unprecedented, the transformation of slavery's brutality into a coordinated system of experimentation. The mistresses had turned their plantations into laboratories of human suffering, treating the enslaved not as workers or property, but as raw material for their grotesque pursuit of knowledge and control. During the exchange periods, the mistresses turned cruelty into a kind of science. Every reaction of their subjects was catalogued with obsessive precision. They developed elaborate classification systems, assigning enslaved men to categories based on temperament, intelligence, endurance, and what they chillingly called correction potential. Charts tracked which punishments broke a man fastest, which torments left lasting scars on the mind, and which combinations of pain and manipulation produced total submission. Most disturbing was their systematic exploitation of family ties. They had realized that physical punishments, often hardened resolve pain, could be endured. Scars could be worn like proof of defiance. But the mere threat of harm to loved ones reached deeper tearing at a man's very sense of self. The women mapped kinship networks across all 7 plantations with genealogical detail, noting husbands, fathers, brothers, sons, and close companions. They learned to wield these bonds like weapons. A man might be told that his resistance had doomed his wife to be sold to a sugar plantation in Louisiana, or that his child was already suffering as punishment for his defiance. Some families were deliberately separated, then reunited under cruelly staged circumstances, reunions twisted into tools of control. One of the most brutal methods involved convincing a man that his wife had died, letting him grieve for weeks, only to reveal she was alive and being tortured because of his choices. By 1845, the network had fully evolved. Each plantation possessed its own so-called correction facilities, purpose-built chambers disguised as punishment cells, but in reality designed for experimentation. Fletcher's descriptions proved true. Soundproof walls, heavy restraints, specialized furniture, observation booths, even writing desks for meticulous note-taking. Within these rooms, the mistresses recorded their work with the diligence of scholars. Their journals contained anatomical drawings, charts of pain thresholds, measurements of pulse and breathing, detailed logs of psychological collapse. They timed how long it took before a man stopped praying, before he renounced his family, before he no longer looked another human in the eye. Hartwell's investigation found that they approached the destruction of human dignity with the same calculated order one might apply to breeding stock or testing new crops. Every scream, every breakdown, every surrender was data. It was not rage or passion, it was controlled clinical cruelty. Confirmation came from an unlikely ally, Dr. Edmund Carey, a physician from New Orleans who had occasionally been called to the district. Meeting Hartwell in his French Quarter office, Carey poured a bourbon with trembling hands as he recounted what he had seen. In over 2 decades of practice, he said he had never encountered injuries like those the mistresses presented as disciplinary accidents. They bore the unmistakable marks of careful study wounds, inflicted not in anger, but in pursuit of knowledge. Carey admitted the women had sought his expertise directly. They asked about pain thresholds, the body's limits for survival, without permanent disability techniques for creating agony, without leaving visible marks and drugs that could cloud memory or warp personality. They framed these questions as humanitarian new treatments for violent or disobedient slaves. But to Carey, it was clear they were building methods of control, not healing. "Inspector," he whispered, "they are not experimenting on illness. They are experimenting on the very boundaries of what it means to be human." By mid-October, Hartwell realized he was staring into something far larger than isolated cruelty. The women had not only built their own facilities, they had built an entire intellectual framework to justify them. They collected European medical texts, commissioned anatomical diagrams, and maintained correspondence with physicians abroad, dressing their atrocities in the language of science. Their so-called libraries were in truth arsenals of human vulnerability, weaponized through careful study and deliberate practice. Dr. Carey's private admissions confirmed what Hartwell was beginning to suspect: the conspiracy reached well beyond the plantations. On at least 6 occasions, the physician had been asked to certify deaths as natural causes, when the bodies bore clear evidence of deliberate harm. When he objected, he was told that discipline sometimes produced complications, and that his duty was to sign the papers, not investigate. That meant coroners, overseers, and local officials were either complicit or too terrified to resist. The circle's cruelty was protected by a web of silence and corruption. The real breakthrough came at Magnolia Grove. Victoria Pembroke's personal library was unlike anything Hartwell had ever seen in the South, 800 volumes locked in walnut cases that climbed to the ceiling. At first glance, it seemed like the collection of an unusually curious plantation mistress. But the subject matter was chilling. Works on psychology, anatomy, interrogation manuals from Europe's darker histories, treatises on torture, and the latest theories on racial hierarchy. Victoria had not only read these books, she corresponded with their authors, exchanging letters filled with her own observations and questions. Behind false panels, Hartwell found the true prize journals, neatly written in Victoria's precise hand, dating back to 1841. They were not diaries. They were research logs. Each entry described subjects men identified by name, age, family ties, and faith. Their behaviors were documented before and after treatment. Protocols were laid out like recipes, with day-by-day instructions and outcomes recorded in clinical detail. Cross-references linked her cases to those of the other women, forming a database of human suffering disguised as plantation management. Case study number 23, dated March 15, 1844, etched itself into Hartwell's memory. Subject: Thomas Jennings, age 26. Husband, father of 2, man of faith. His defiance was noted in the opening assessment, his posture, his steady gaze, his attempts to comfort others. Over the next 14 days, his will was dismantled step by step. Isolation, starvation, sleep deprivation, recorded voices of family members crying for help, then fabricated evidence of their suffering. By day 12, Thomas believed his wife and children had been sold to a brutal sugar plantation because of his resistance. By day 14, he broke completely. Victoria's closing words read like a surgeon's notes after a successful operation. Subject now demonstrates complete submission. All patterns of resistance eliminated. Hartwell closed the journal with shaking hands. It was no longer just evidence of abuse. It was proof of a calculated system of psychological and physical experimentation perfected over years and shielded by some of the most powerful families in Mississippi. The deeper Hartwell read, the clearer it became that the correctional circle was not only a chamber of horrors, but a fully evolved system with far-reaching influence. The journals described how emotional bonds were dismantled with surgical precision. Proud men humiliated until they loathed themselves, religious men bombarded with orchestrated blasphemies until faith collapsed. Family men convinced their resistance condemned wives and children to endless suffering. Once broken, they were rebuilt into hollow shells, obedient, unquestioning, stripped of memory and desire. Husbands returned unable to recognize their wives, fathers no longer acknowledging their children, craftsmen reduced to automatons of labor. Hartwell realized the women were treating identity like clay, reshaping it at will. Their reconstruction protocols relied on prolonged isolation, alternating confusion and coercion, and the gradual reintroduction of human contact conditioned on obedience. Survivors emerged as something unrecognizable, no longer men but instruments trained to obey without hesitation and incapable of rebellion. The system's cruelty was only half the story. Hartwell's investigation uncovered its profitability. Financial ledgers hidden in Victoria Pembroke's library showed the women had monetized their atrocities. The processed slaves commanded premium prices in southern markets, advertised quietly through whisper networks of traders and overseers as men specially prepared to be loyal, tractable, and resistant to outside influence. The 7 families generated over $50,000 a year in additional revenue, a staggering sum at the time. Wealthy buyers even placed special orders. A sugar baron in New Orleans paid for slaves stripped of all memory of family or freedom. A Mississippi steamboat company requested workers conditioned to ignore free blacks they might encounter in northern ports. Most shocking was Hartwell's discovery that free black men were also being targeted. Legal loopholes, forged documents, and false accusations of fugitive status gave the mistresses pretexts to drag them into their system. Samuel Fletcher himself narrowly escaped when his papers were challenged. 5 others from the Natchez area had vanished within 2 years, their disappearances dismissed by local authorities as voluntary departures. Fletcher believed they had been processed and sold southward, their identities erased forever. And then came the revelation that chilled Hartwell to his core. The Natchez Circle was not alone. Correspondence in the Magnolia Grove Library revealed letters from Georgia, South Carolina, Alabama, even Virginia. Plantation mistresses across the South were studying, copying, and spreading these methods. The Natchez women had begun hosting private gatherings, masquerading as social visits, but functioning as seminars in human destruction. One letter from Margaret Fitzgerald of Savannah dripped with gratitude. She thanked Charlotte Vandenberg for her instruction and reported complete success in breaking 11 of 12 subjects using Natchez methods. She praised the innovation of family separation as a primary tool and requested consultation on building her own soundproof chambers. The realization hit Hartwell like a physical blow. This was no longer just a hidden conspiracy in Mississippi. It was a growing doctrine, a movement spreading its roots across the South. The correctional circle was becoming an institution, its lessons replicated and perfected by others threatening to entrench cruelty on a scale no single plantation could contain. By the middle of October, Hartwell finally grasped the true scope of what he was up against. The correctional circle was not just a sadistic pastime for wealthy women. It was being embraced by Southern elites as a blueprint for social control. Professors, physicians, even politicians were corresponding with the mistresses, praising their advancements in racial management. Some letters suggested that their methods could be applied far beyond enslaved blacks, to poor whites, immigrants, even Native Americans. What Hartwell had uncovered was not simply a local conspiracy, but the seed of a larger system, a scientific framework for preserving hierarchy through the deliberate destruction of human dignity. As his investigation deepened, the circle tightened around him. At first, the pressure came subtly. Hotel clerks who once answered questions readily now avoided his gaze. Officials who had promised cooperation suddenly claimed to be too busy. Witnesses who had agreed to meet with him disappeared overnight. Then came the unmistakable warning. On October 10th, he returned to his hotel room to find his belongings rifled through, his papers rearranged. On the pillow lay a note written in elegant, practiced handwriting. "Inspector, some mysteries are better left unsolved. Consider your health and that of your family in Maine." The threat was polite, refined, and absolutely clear. They knew about Martha, about his 2 children in Portland. Their influence extended far beyond Mississippi, and they were willing to reach across state lines if necessary. 2 days later, Hartwell tried to seize the initiative. Without notice, he rode to Cedar Hill Plantation, hoping to catch Constance Vanderhorst off guard and perhaps gather evidence too blatant to conceal. But Constance was ready for him. She stood waiting with her overseer, 2 armed guards, and a man introduced as her husband, supposedly returned from New Orleans. Hartwell's stomach tightened. He had confirmed through telegraph that very morning that Vanderhorst remained in New Orleans on business. Whoever stood beside her was either an imposter or a collaborator brought in to play the part. Constance's manner was icily formal, stripped of the false warmth she had once shown. She declared there had been a misunderstanding about the limits of federal authority and produced a medical certificate claiming that an outbreak of contagious illness made the slave quarters off-limits. To an untrained eye, the certificate looked authentic, complete with the seal of a New Orleans physician. But Hartwell saw through it immediately. The paper was too new. The ink still bright, and the signature too closely resembled handwriting he had seen in the mistress's own correspondence. This was no accidental cover-up. It was deliberate forgery. As Hartwell prepared to leave, the impostor approached him with the oily assurance of a man accustomed to bending others with money. "Inspector," he said smoothly, "perhaps we can resolve this matter efficiently. Federal investigators, I understand, are not always compensated in proportion to their talents. A man of your intelligence might find certain consulting opportunities most rewarding." The bribe was offered with the calm confidence of someone who had made such arrangements before. Hartwell's refusal was immediate and firm. The man's expression hardened. His voice dropped, stripped of pretense. "Very well, Inspector. But understand, your interference with private rights and legitimate business cannot continue indefinitely. This region has ways of dealing with agitators who do not know their place." At that moment, Hartwell understood fully. The women had allies, men of wealth and power, men who could command weapons courts, even governments. His work was no longer just an investigation. It was a battle against a machine designed to protect itself at any cost. That night's invitation to Elmwood was framed as hospitality, but Hartwell quickly understood it for what it was: a trap dressed up in silverware and chandeliers. The great dining room glittered with crystal Venetian chandeliers and gilt mirrors. Yet beneath the polished surface was a carefully staged display of power. All 7 mistresses were present, their overseers at their backs, joined by local officials whose loyalties were clearly bought and paid for. A handful of men introduced as business associates carried themselves with the calm readiness of hired muscle. Every element of the evening had been orchestrated to remind Hartwell that he was hopelessly outnumbered. The conversation began innocuously enough, discussions of northern politics, trade tariffs, and steamboat companies. But the mistress's questions soon turned sharp. They pressed him for details about Martha and the children, about his finances, about whether he had friends in Congress who might protect him. All of it was delivered with sugar-coated civility. But Hartwell recognized the probing for what it was: intelligence gathering, mapping his vulnerabilities. Then came the threats disguised as philosophy. Elelenina Dabney insisted that their methods were misunderstood by northern sensibilities necessary for order among primitive people. Victoria Pembroke smiled thinly as she explained that their techniques were in their own way humane, an investment in stability. Isabella Fairfax's words chilled Hartwell the most. She spoke softly, noting how previous federal investigators had visited Natchez, only to conclude quickly that their fears were unfounded, returning north with reports praising plantation efficiency. The implication was unmistakable. Others had come before him, and others had been silenced. Henrietta Hawthorne delivered the second blade, casually remarking on the dangers of the Mississippi River pirates. Steamboat accidents, fevers in the swamp air, accidents that had claimed the lives of outsiders. Lucinda Belmonte twisted the knife, smiling as she warned that they would hate for Hartwell to meet the same fate as other officials who misunderstood their role. Finally, Charlotte Vandenberg leaned in, her voice calm and absolute. She reminded Hartwell that their families were not merely wealthy planters, but pillars of Southern power with influence stretching from Washington to London. They controlled banks, shipping companies, newspapers, and politicians. His authority in Mississippi, she said, existed only at their sufferance, and that sufferance was wearing thin. Hartwell left Elmwood under no illusions. The dinner had been both a warning and a declaration he was facing not just 7 women, but an organized criminal syndicate with international reach. Yet, amid the menace, they had revealed too much the scale of their influence, their coordination, their arrogance in believing they were untouchable. He now had proof that this was not local brutality, but a conspiracy threatening the entire republic. The next morning, the crisis became personal. Samuel Fletcher failed to appear at their arranged meeting place. When Hartwell inquired at his home, his wife Mary opened the door in a state of near hysteria. Samuel had vanished during the night. The door left ajar, a scuff mark on the floor, as though dragged, not walked. Mary whispered through tears that she had seen figures outside in the dark. Hours before dawn meant she did not recognize one of them speaking with a woman's voice. It was no disappearance. Fletcher had been taken. The kidnapping of Samuel Fletcher shattered any illusion Hartwell had left that this was simply a plantation scandal. It proved that the correctional circle's web stretched far beyond the 7 families, into courts, jails, sheriff's offices, and even the telegraph lines. Mary's trembling account of armed men at her door at midnight, dragging her husband away while mocking his freedom papers, made it brutally clear. Fletcher had been marked for correction, and the men who took him acted with impunity because they knew no authority in Natchez would intervene. When Hartwell tried to file reports, he was dismissed with a shrug. Free blacks leave all the time, he was told, as though Fletcher's vanishing had no meaning. By October 13th, the conspiracy was tightening around him like a noose. His communications were intercepted. His room was searched repeatedly. Even his food came from kitchens controlled by the families. Then came the most terrifying revelation: they had eyes in Portland. Notes and whispered warnings reached him, describing Martha's shopping trips, his children's school hours, the routine of his household. The message was unmistakable. The women could strike him or his family at any time, anywhere. That night, Hartwell sat in his dim hotel room, evidence spread before him like a battlefield. He faced an impossible choice. If he tried to rescue Fletcher or others still trapped, he would almost certainly be killed and his files destroyed. But if he abandoned them to their fate, there was a chance he could smuggle the records north, exposing the conspiracy for what it was. The decision weighed not only on his own survival, but on the fate of thousands across the South who would remain in the Circle's grip unless Washington learned the truth. On October 14th, he chose. With Fletcher gone, there was only one path forward: gather definitive proof. That night, under the cover of darkness, Hartwell slipped toward Riverside Estate. Guided by maps Fletcher had drawn before his disappearance and his own days of reconnaissance, he avoided the main roads, hugging the Mississippi's treacherous shoreline. The river was a black mirror, full of hidden snags and currents that could swallow a man whole. Spanish moss swayed like gallows ropes in the night breeze. Every splash from the unseen creatures in the water, every owl cry echoing like a lament, deepened the sense that he was descending into some infernal realm. When the plantation yard came into view, the sight seared itself into his mind. Dozens of torches blazed in precise geometric patterns, their flames casting long, shifting shadows across a spectacle that masqueraded as a social gathering, but was in truth an orchestrated nightmare. The 7 women, radiant in gowns of silk and satin, moved with the grace of aristocrats at a ball. Yet instead of music, the night was filled with screams. Instead of dancing, the women drifted between stations of torment, recording observations and debating refinements like scholars at a symposium. 12 enslaved men writhed under devices designed not just to hurt, but to measure suffering. At the center, Elena Dabney presided with icy authority. Before her stood a gleaming contraption of polished wood and brass, its fittings too precise to be anything but custom-made. A man named Joseph was locked within. It held in a position that allowed pressure to be applied to different parts of his body with chilling control. Elena turned dials and levers, while Joseph groaned, screamed, and choked back sobs. Her notes were meticulous. Too little stress yields no permanent result. Too much kills the subject before useful data is obtained. The key is balance, the precise threshold where pain becomes instruction, where suffering bends the will without breaking the body. She checked her pocket watch, scribbled in her journal, and nodded to her colleagues as if lecturing students at a university. Joseph's screams echoing across the torchlit yard were not obstacles. They were data points. Each cry, each shudder, each broken plea was entered into a record proof that the science of cruelty was advancing one step further. They kept their work clinical and organized, turning cruelty into a methodical science that cataloged how to break a person and remake him with charts of personality types and notes on which pressures worked best for proud men, for the devout, and for those whose hearts lived in their families. And they taught one another to weaponize love and faith until men stopped being men. Victoria Pembroke ran a loyalty station that forced impossible choices between a man and his family, using shadow sounds and carefully staged illusions to convince a husband that his wife and child were suffering. And she recorded the precise moment his resolve crumbled, while Constance Vanderhorst perfected identity dissolution through sensory deprivation and sleep removal, until intelligent men like David no longer answered to their names. Isabella Fairfax engineered rituals meant to break religious belief because the loss of faith made men easier to reshape. Henrietta Hawthorne experimented with memory modification that blurred truth and falsehood until subjects could no longer trust their own pasts, and Lucinda Belmonte applied measured clinical pain with instruments designed for control rather than random cruelty. They photographed results, sketched anatomical notes, timed reactions with pocket watches, and compiled case files that read like laboratory reports, and they found a market for their work because processed men sold for premium prices as obedient labor, which turned their experiments into profit and spread the methods through secret letters and seminars to other plantations across the South. Worst of all, they began to target free black men by challenging papers and forcing some into the same system. And that night Hartwell watched Samuel Fletcher arrive, broken from days of abuse, paraded as both punishment and a warning to anyone who might help an outside. And as the women compared notes and planned to expand their operations, Hartwell realized he had stumbled on an organized movement to manufacture obedience and erase identity on an industrial scale. The women closed their gathering with the same calm precision that marked everything they did, speaking not as local aristocrats, but as visionaries who saw themselves shaping the future of civilization. Charlotte Vandenberg declared with pride, that their work represented a revolution in social control, proof that their class and race were destined to lead. Victoria Pembroke went further, unveiling inquiries from Southern planters, military officers, and even Northern industrialists eager for methods to pacify immigrant workers. Their ambitions stretched far beyond the cotton fields of Mississippi. For Hartwell, the realization was crushing. The Circle was not simply preserving power. It was preparing to export its methods like a commodity, transforming slavery's cruelties into a blueprint for controlling entire societies. Worse still, he saw that they were eliminating the very witnesses who could expose them. The tortured men who still breathed were being marked for disposal, their broken bodies silenced before they could speak. Samuel Fletcher was among those condemned, his defiance punished with a death sentence to erase his testimony. Hartwell's choice crystallized into a terrible clarity. If he tried to save Fletcher and the others that night, he would die, and the evidence would vanish with him. If he escaped with the records, there was a chance, however slim, that Washington might be forced to act. With the weight of every victim pressing on him, he chose survival for the sake of the truth. Through the long hours of darkness, Hartwell worked feverishly, copying reports, preparing packets, and sending evidence through every channel he could. Steamboat captains sympathetic to abolitionists, Northern merchants, even foreign consuls in New Orleans, who recoiled at the atrocities described. His final coded telegram on October 15th was brief but devastating. Systematic brutalities beyond documentation confirmed. 7 families operating organized torture network. International connections established. Request immediate military intervention. Personal safety compromised. Critical evidence secured. Local officials intercepted the message, but Hartwell's careful dispersal of duplicates ensured the truth could not be buried. That foresight saved the investigation. On October 17th, as Hartwell rode the Natchez Trace toward Jackson, professional killers struck. These were not bandits, but men hired to stage robberies and leave corpses that raised no suspicion. Hartwell barely escaped, wounded and bleeding, stumbling into the wilderness, where he hid for days among the swamps and forests. He survived only by sheer will, clinging to the hope that his evidence was already beyond the conspirators' reach. Federal reinforcements arrived weeks later. On November 3, 1847, troops from New Orleans, joined by Treasury investigators and Army engineers, launched coordinated raids on all 7 plantations. What they found eclipsed even Hartwell's descriptions. Torture chambers filled with custom-built devices gleamed with brass fittings and leather straps. Walls were lined with soundproof padding. Journals documented thousands of case studies with scientific detachment. Financial ledgers exposed profits from the sale of broken men. Letters revealed networks stretching across the South and plans to expand beyond slavery into broader systems of control. And then there were the survivors, living proof of what had been done. Men who no longer knew their own names. Fathers who recoiled from their wives and children. Former leaders reduced to empty obedience. Their very existence was testimony no forged letter or bribed official could erase. The federal raids of November 1847 brought the Circle's horrors into the light. But the aftermath proved that exposing evil was not the same as eradicating it. In the spring and summer of 1848, the 7 women were brought to trial in Jackson. For the first time, a courtroom became a stage where enslaved survivors' men, shattered in body and spirit, were asked to speak of what had been done to them. Some could barely form words, others had no memory of who they were, and still others stared blankly at their own families as though they were strangers. Yet the fragments of testimony, coupled with the evidence Hartwell and the federal troops had secured, painted a picture so grotesque that newspapers around the world carried the story. Marcus Washington's widow took the stand, reading from the hidden journal her husband had written in secret. His words documenting the destruction of his family and his spirit. Samuel Fletcher, permanently crippled by his captivity, but still alive, testified about the torture he had endured and the network of lawmen and officials who had protected the mistresses. Dr. Edmund Carey, the New Orleans physician, confirmed what the record suggested, that these injuries bore the marks of deliberate, systematic experimentation. But in the courtroom, justice bent under the weight of money and influence. The defendants arrived each day, dressed as grieving matrons, defended by former senators, governors, and federal judges. Their lawyers argued that federal authorities had no right to interfere in internal plantation discipline. They claimed their clients were being persecuted for exercising lawful authority over their property. Southern intellectuals filled the witness box to praise their brilliance, calling them pioneers in social science. Professors suggested their work might help treat mental illness. Even a few northern businessmen defended them, arguing their methods represented innovations in labor management. The verdicts reflected the corruption of the system. Charlotte Vandenberg and Elelena Dabney, deemed the ringleaders, were sentenced to 20 years, but served only 7 before presidential pardons freed them. Victoria Pembroke and Constance Vanderhorst received 15 years, but were released in 5 after sympathetic physicians declared them too ill for prison. Isabella Fairfax, Henrietta Hawthorne, and Lucinda Belmonte avoided prison entirely, escaping with fines and a temporary ban on owning slaves, a ban ignored as soon as federal attention shifted elsewhere. For the victims, there was no justice. Freed on paper, most were too deeply scarred to live independently. Some wandered the plantations where they had been broken, unable to rejoin their families or communities. Others slipped into silent shadows of men who no longer knew their own names. The facilities themselves were ordered destroyed, but in many cases, the doors were only sealed. Local whispers persisted for decades that experiments continued in secret, carried out by protégés or hidden societies who had learned from the Circle's methods. Inspector Hartwell, hailed in abolitionist newspapers as a hero, bore scars of his own. His wounds from the Natchez Trace healed, but his nights were haunted by screams he could not forget. He resigned from federal service in 1849, spending his remaining years compiling exhaustive reports, tracking other victims, and warning that similar conspiracies could arise wherever power was left unchecked. Those reports were sealed by Washington, deemed too dangerous for the public. When finally declassified in 1963, they revealed a scope of cruelty so vast that even then entire sections were redacted under the guise of national security. The legacy of the correctional circle stretched far beyond slavery. In secret, military officers, prison wardens, and social theorists studied their methods. Techniques of isolation, identity erasure, and loyalty engineering seeped into Native American boarding schools, immigrant detention centers, and later, into modern interrogation programs. What had begun as a hidden crime on the plantations of Mississippi lived on as a dark inheritance of American social control, long after the 7 mistresses were gone. The Natchez conspiracy may have been the most fully documented of its kind, but the evidence uncovered in 1847 and 1848 strongly suggested it was not unique. Among the seized letters and journals were references to sister networks in Georgia, South Carolina, Virginia, Alabama, and Louisiana, where plantation mistresses and their allies were experimenting with comparable systems of psychological control. How many men, women, and children suffered in those hidden chambers will likely never be known. Much of the evidence was destroyed deliberately, and what remains may still be locked away in private family archives beyond the reach of historians. The scandal left an indelible scar on the Natchez district itself. Mansions once celebrated as symbols of Southern refinement stood abandoned, their owners ruined by exposure or fleeing prosecution. Property values collapsed, businesses relocated, and a region once synonymous with wealth and elegance became infamous for cruelty. The decline endured for generations, the memory of grandeur forever tainted by whispers of the circle. And yet denial persisted. Even a century and a half later, some local historians and civic leaders downplayed the events, dismissing them as abolitionist propaganda or the regrettable but understandable excesses of their era. Such rationalizations reflect the enduring power of the same systems that enabled the circle in the first place, hierarchies of wealth, race, and privilege that disguised oppression as order and cruelty as progress. The Natchez Correctional Circle is a chilling reminder that the worst atrocities often emerge not from chaos, but from order. Systematized, rationalized, and conducted by those who see themselves as refined, educated, and morally justified. These women did not act as outlaws, but as architects of social engineering, wielding their intelligence and resources not to uplift, but to perfect degradation. Their story forces us to confront an uncomfortable truth. The most dangerous monsters in history are often those who appear the most civilized.